How do we know what words to use in a given situation? That's a pretty generic question, but it's actually a very valuable skill. We've all likely been in a scenario where we weren't quite sure what to say next. Maybe you've been in a stressful meeting that you were just hoping goes your way. Maybe you've been in a conversation that's slowly turning into a conflict. Or maybe you're interested in someone and you really hope that they're interested in you as well. In all three of those scenarios, the words you choose could determine whether you get the outcome that you actually want. In this video, we're going to talk about verbal communication, or more specifically, how to use language to ensure the other person gets the message that you intend and ultimately encourage the outcome that you want. So the first thing I want to talk about are two types of meanings: denotation and connotation. Denotation is simply the dictionary definition of a word or sentence. And we likely share the same denotation, right? As long as we're both familiar with what the definition of a word or sentence actually is, we share the same denotation. If we don't know what a word means, we should ask the person what it means. Connotation, on the other hand, is any additional meaning that we attach to a word or sentence. And that encompasses a lot. That could encompass the history of the word, the emotional reaction to a word, or the picture that the word actually paints in our head. And I'll give you an example, right, of an overlapping denotation but a different connotation. The words youthful and childish have roughly the same dictionary definition. Yet, the word youthful, when you hear that, you might think of somebody who's energetic and young. But when I say the word childish, all of a sudden you might think of someone who's acting in a negative, childlike way. Those are different connotations, right? They paint a different picture in our minds. I'll give you another example. If I were to say to my wife, Sydney, "You look really beautiful today." What's my denotation? Well, exactly what I said. She looks good today. And that's my connotation as well. They're overlapping in this scenario. But what if she were to fire back with, "Don't I look good every day?" What's her connotation? Well, if she responded that way, it's likely that her connotation, she latched on to the word today and asked, well, what does this statement say about me every other day? Do I not look good? So how do I actually, clear up this miscommunication? Well, I can walk through what I meant in my denotation and my connotation. Now, I'm not likely going to use those terms because she might look back at me and go, "This isn't a communication class, okay? I'm not one of your students." Right? But I can say something like, "No, you actually look really good every day. You just look especially good today, and I'm sorry I don't tell you that enough." What's that? I acknowledged my denotation, and I assured her, well, my connotation was actually this. Right? So we can use these tools to actually clear up miscommunication. So let's talk about some language-based barriers. We've already seen how both denotation and connotation can be a barrier to verbal communication, right? If we have different ideas about what a word means, it's going to make it difficult for us to communicate effectively. A couple other ones I want to touch on. Jargon. What's jargon? Jargon is a set of words that's specific to a subgroup of people. So we think about professional jargon a lot of times. Imagine I'm in a room full of doctors who are using medical terminology to describe complex surgeries. Am I going to know what they're saying? Probably not. Most of what they're saying is going to go right over my head, and it's going to make it difficult for us to communicate effectively. One more concept I want to touch on as a language-based barrier is divergence. Divergence is where we intentionally use a slightly different speaking style, or maybe not so slightly different, maybe very different speaking style from our audience. This is often done to highlight some sort of power difference between the speaker and the audience. Now, we want to use traces of divergence when we're public speaking, right? Or maybe when we're lecturing or recording an educational video, but we don't want to overdo it. When we overdo it, and we speak in such a way that our audience just isn't used to hearing, something's going to happen. Either they're going to tune out, or they might become confused with the terminology that you're using. So all four of these language-based barriers here, difference in denotation, difference in connotation, jargon, and divergence, they're all hinting at the same thing, and that's a difference in vocabulary. So how do we actually use language effectively? Well, we want to use overlapping vocabulary. And so in order to do this, we're going to need to make an educated guess at what our audience's vocabulary might be, both their denotations. So, right, if I use a word that my audience might not be familiar with, I might define it very simply, very quickly, and then move forward. Or, right, if my audience has a different connotation, I might need to be more specific in my language to really explain what my connotation is. And that actually ties into the next thing I want to talk about. When it comes to using language effectively, we want to use concrete terms over vague terms. Well, what does that mean? I'll give you an example. The word young is a very vague word. If someone were to ask me, what is John like? And somewhere in my description, along the way I say, he's young, that's pretty generic, pretty vague. And depending on your frame of reference, you might get a very different idea about what young means. If I were to say that to my dad, he might imagine someone who's in their 30s or even their 40s. But if I were to say it to one of my students in the classroom, they might imagine someone who's 16 or 17. So we want to be more specific. We want to use more concrete terms. So instead of using the word young, maybe I state John's actual age if I know what it is. John is 21 years old. If I don't know his actual age, maybe I just use a caveat after young. He's young, somewhere between 20 and 25. And that's just an educated guess. But when we do this, we use more concrete terms. It more accurately sends the message that I have in here to you, right? And that is our goal in communication, right? So we also want to use convergence. What does that mean? Well, that's the flip side of divergence. That's intentionally adopting a speaking style that your audience uses. And when we do this, it's much more easy for us to communicate. A couple other tools we can use. We want to encourage our audience to ask questions. And teachers often do this in the classroom. Are there any questions on this? And sometimes the student feels comfortable enough to ask a question if they have one, and sometimes they don't. An additional thing that I like to do in my class, or even in some meetings that I've ran, is actually have the receiver paraphrase the message back. So maybe I'm concluding a meeting, and I say, hey, Abby, could you actually go ahead and sum up what we talked about today in this short meeting? And what does that do? Well, she now can summarize what I've said in different words, and that shows me that she understands it. And if somewhere along the way she repeats something that I didn't actually mean, it gives me a chance to stop her and correct her. So that's how we use language effectively. We try to use a vocabulary that our audience is familiar with, both regarding their denotation and connotation. We try to customize the message to the audience using convergence, and we want to use specific language, concrete terms.